Good evening, everybody. My name is Ahmed Ragab. I'm the Richard T. Watson Assistant Professor of Science and Religion, I direct the Science, Religion, and Culture program. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here today. This is our first panel discussion in a year-long investigation, research, and collaboration between SRC, Science, Religion, and Culture program, and IMA World Health that you will hear more about today. So there will be 2 more panels this year in the spring, and we will let you know when exactly. I don't have the dates in front of me. First, I would like to welcome our dear friend Rick Santos, the President and Chief Executive Officer of IMA World Health, and also an alumnus of HDS. Rick and IMA have been at the center of this work from the beginning, and their energy and dedication to this process is a source of inspiration for all of our work. Rick?
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. I'm just going to take a little bit of time kind of setting the context for the discussion today. But before I do that, I just want to say a couple of things. First, there's a lot of people who have worked on sexual and gender-based violence issues for a long time. A lot of folks in the faith community who've done tremendous amount of work. Here in the Boston area, there's a group that we've connected with called Safe Havens. So there's tremendous amount of dedication and commitment to addressing sexual and gender-based violence, and we're really excited to be in conversation with those groups. But one of the things that we have realized since we got involved in this issue is how many gaps there actually are, and how much is actually not being done. So I just want to give a little bit of context about IMA World Health. We're actually we weren't formed to be an organization that worked on this. We're a faith-based public health organization doing work internationally. So we have a mission of health, healing, and well-being for all. And we do a lot of programs globally around health system strengthening. We do HIV and AIDS, malaria, neglected tropical diseases, things like that. But about 6 years ago, we were approached by a woman named Lynn Lucy, and she was a VSO volunteer in the DRC about 35, 40 years ago, and she met a Congolese doctor named Joe Lucy, and they created something called Heal Africa. So I don't want to go into all the details, and you can always look a lot of what I'm talking about up online. But Lynn Lucy was committed. She actually passed away a few years ago due to cancer. But Lynn was really committed to this issue and addressing it in the context of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, especially in the Goma, Eastern Congo area. So Lynn pulled us in and said, we want to partner with you on a U.S. government-funded project. We also started working with another local partner there, a guy named Dr. Denis Mukwege. So Dr. Mukwege is a very interesting figure. He runs a hospital also in the Bukavu part of Congo. And he was actually nominated last year to be a Nobel Prize laureate, a Peace Prize. He didn't win, but he was one of the top 5 finalists. He's just been a tireless advocate for the rights of women. He's a surgeon. He's done thousands of fistula surgeries. And really IMA's involvement came because of these relationships. And so out of that project, which we're actually in the final year of, I went to Goma with several of our board members. And in that moment where we walked into a room, actually it was an open air space, and we were asked to have a conversation with some of the survivors of this terrible violence. I was expecting to walk into a room of 3 or 4 or 5 people. The room had over 100 people in it. And it was kind of at that moment with several of our board members that IMA said, we have to do something more about this issue. And kind of serendipitously at the same time, we ran into a group in the UK called We Will Speak Out. And they actually had just released a report called Silent No More. And really, their report started looking at the issue of the church's failure to address SGBV issues in Africa. They looked at the DRC, they looked at Burundi and several other African countries. And so we were talking to them about our project. And so part of the way we work as IMA is we don't actually look to recreate things that are already created, and we look for partnerships. And so we asked to join their platform, and from that moment on, we created what's called We Will Speak Out US. And really the idea of this was to bring in different faith groups and to try to raise awareness on the issue of sexual and gender-based violence. So we had about a year and a half, 2 years now of work as We Will Speak Out. So I will use kind of IMA and We Will Speak Out interchangeably. We've had panels. We actually had Dr. Mukwege in Washington last spring. A little bit, was it last spring? It was maybe a year and a half ago, and we co-sponsored a panel with the Brookings Institute. We had a panel at the UN Commission Status of Women that they hold annually in New York. We developed a sermon guide. We set up. We tried to get. We wrote a pledge, and we had tried to get people to sign that. So we had over 2,000 signatures. We created this kind of platform, and we had 11. I think now we're at 14 member organizations. And I think the idea was, and we learned a lot over the last couple of years. And so the question is, what don't we know? And so I think that was one of the biggest things that came out of that year-long kind of experience was there's not enough data on this. When we started asking the question, what are churches doing? How can the churches do more? What are pastors doing? We really couldn't find anything. Now, the United Church of Christ actually had done a very small study themselves, about 250 pastors. But other than that, we really couldn't find data on this issue. So probably early last spring, we started a conversation with Sojourners. And I think many of you know it's both I know it as the magazine, but it's an organization that does a lot of human rights and social justice work. And so we started talking to Sojourners about this idea that there's not a lot of information on what the faith community is doing on the issue of sexual and gender-based violence. And so we ended up talking to a group called Lifeway Research. And they were doing a national study of 1,000 pastors, and they were doing it on some mental health issues. And so we were able to get 20 questions inserted into that national survey. And so what came out of that was a lot of data, and so we boiled it down to the report called Broken Silence. And so there's copies over here. It's downloadable online. And I think I don't think it was a surprise, but in a sense, when we first started looking at the data, I would say my reaction was it was very stark to me. And so one of the key things to me that I go back, it's the second point on the slide, and that really is that 65% of pastors that were surveyed, and now this survey includes older and younger pastors, I would say mostly male, both evangelical and mainline. So there was a real I think a diversity of folks that were being asked this question. And we asked, how often do you speak about this issue? And the fact that 65% spoke about it once or less was really telling to me. It really told me that the issue of domestic violence, of sexual and gender-based violence, is not a core message of the church. Now, I opened up saying a lot of people are doing a lot of good work on this. There's a lot of individuals, a lot of churches have talked about this, but it isn't a core message. And I think that's really, one of the takeaways that I'd like maybe as the panel discusses this later this evening to kind of deal with that issue. Another key finding was 74% of pastors surveyed underestimated the level of sexual and domestic violence in their congregations. And we find this, I think this is an issue that we find not just in churches, but I think we find it everywhere. It's the idea that it's a problem over there, it's not a problem here. Or, in some of the conversations I've been having with different church-related organizations, IMA is a member organization. I was talking to some folks at one of our members, and they said, our churches are really interested in this issue, but they really want to talk about trafficking. And so, I think that's trafficking is a significant issue, and it absolutely needs to be addressed. But to me, it was just another example of, dealing with this issue someplace else. And so, for me, the underestimating of what is in their own congregation, I think gives maybe a better understanding of why we do that, or why they were thinking that. I think the other kind of big finding was that not only were a number of folks not aware of local resources, which is really critical because pastors in our studies, I'm an MDiv, not MDiv, MTS 92, and it was really this is not a topic that comes up. It's not something they're taught in seminaries, and so for me, not being knowledgeable of local resources is really a critical area that needed to be addressed. And then I think the other thing was that we found was very shocking is that they gave wrong advice. And so all of this is just, I think, there's so much data here that we don't know. There's so much more that we could know. And so this is, from my perspective, the tip of the iceberg. I think I want to leave on a more of a positive note. One of the things that the report did find is that, and again, we were looking at the data, when you say to someone, well, would you do more if you had this and that? If so, we asked them, if you had more resources or more training, would you speak more on this issue? And 8 out of 10 said yes. I'm not sure why 2 out of 10 didn't. But so, for me, that this was like one hopeful sign, and I think that this has really led us to a larger conversation. We need more data. We need more information. We need to understand the dynamic that are happening within congregation and within larger churches. So really, I'm so happy to be here. And Ahmed, thank you so much. And I'm really excited about what the panel has to say. For me, the hope was that we see this now, we see this issue coming out in the public in a way that it hadn't. But actually, I'm going to take a step back. 3 years ago, when we first started dealing with this issue as IMA, and We Will Speak Out, I remember the gentleman in Ohio who, I remember the stories that came out where he had basically taken 3 women and basically enslaved them. And that was such a shocking story. And I remember, and then another story came out a couple of weeks later. And then another story came out another week, a couple of weeks later. And I was up in Oregon talking about it, and we were looking at the Oregonian, and there was a story that day in the Oregonian. So this is actually not an issue that hasn't been around or isn't visible. The NFL has probably made it as visible as we've probably seen it in a long time. But it's really, it's an issue that really touches all aspects of our society. So for me, for tonight, my hope is we all in this room have a better understanding of this as people of faith, how it reaches across multiple institutions. In Washington, of course, one of the big issues was the military and how it's handled in the military. And then also just sharing some experiences and concerns. So again, I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. As Rick explained, this survey actually was at the beginning of our collaboration as SRC with IMA. The survey provided very important information, and as Rick said, it's really the tip of the iceberg. And some of the work that we're going to do together, SRC and IMA, throughout the year is to have a qualitative study that it focuses on a number of faith communities to try to understand more of the details of how how this happens in a particular environment, what faith leaders need to do, and what kind of support they would actually require or they would desire to act more effectively in these situations. We also intend to work together with IMA to develop tools that will allow these faith leaders to actually act in a more effective manner to protect and to provide an environment that is safer and friendlier to victims and survivors of SGBV. And we start our conversations today with this panel where we're going to discuss a number of the framing issues that underlie our investigation. So let me first introduce our panelists in the order that they will speak. Mary Setterholm, MDiv 2013, and at Harvard we always like to be proud of everybody who graduates, so we always put the date afterwards. So she received her MDiv here in 2013. She has been a pastoral activist for women in crisis through Serenity Sisters, which is a peer support group that confronts issues of domestic violence, addiction, prostitution, and poverty. Mary has been on-call crisis interventionist for parishes and beach city police chaplains in South California, and Mary's research at HDS traced the historical roots of gender violence and prostitution. Reverend Jeddediah Mannis, MDiv 2004. Reverend Mannis is an ordained UCC minister. He's the founder, minister, and president of the Outdoor Church of Cambridge, which is a church for the chronically homeless men and women. For the past 11 years, the Outdoor Church has offered prayer services and pastoral assistance outdoors in all seasons and all weather in order to be accessible to men and women who, because of shame or embarrassment, hostility, or illness, cannot or will not enter conventional churches. Prior to his ordination in October 2004, Reverend Mannis provided pro bono legal services to many members of Common Cathedral in Boston, an outdoor church for homeless men and women. And last but not least, my dear friend Cheryl Giles. She is the Francis Greenwood Peabody Senior Lecturer on Pastoral Care and Counseling at Harvard Divinity School. She is also a clinical psychologist and has extensive experience in working with children, adolescents, and families with significant mental illness, high-risk behavior, and traumatic stress. Her primary research interests are identifying the role of risk and resilience in developing healthy adolescents and healthcare disparities in African American populations. We asked our panelists 4 main questions that we thought could be the beginning of these conversations. The first question that we asked them is, what is sexual and gender-based violence? In other words, what constitutes this particular phenomenon? While physical abuse, such as physical domestic violence or rape, constitute the most obvious instances of sexual and gender-based violence, we want to explore what else is part of this story. What is the makeup of a landscape, if you will, of abuse and violence? The second question is, what went wrong, or rather, what is wrong? What are the features and culture of a culture that enables, facilitates, and perpetuates abuse, be it media, political, institutional, culture? How can we think about this culture, and what can we do to work against or to modify this particular culture? Third, we asked, in the light of the survey that Rick talked about, how does the experiences of these pastors relate to their own experience, to the panelists' experience? How do they see the role of religious or community leaders in these situations? And finally, and again based on the survey, we asked what differences could there be in relation to other faith communities in different regional, ethnic, or socioeconomic contexts. Again, these questions are only meant to start the conversations, and we look forward to hearing their comments. Mary.
Good evening. All right. I'm beginning this by an inspiration that just suddenly hit me before I got up here. Even though I have clearly something prepared, that's what happens when you're an MDiv, right? You make space. It's called No Place to Hide. And I was hiding. And I had no place to hide. And yes, I was found. And I was found again and again and again and again. And I knew where to go inside when I was found, to another place that maybe I wouldn't be found. And so began a bizarre way of living through the unlivable. But this is the experience, and I represent countless numbers of women and some who have not made it, and some men. I am so sorry that so much of what you read, if you did read this report, seemed to infer that this violence is predominantly against women. It's also against men. So again, like I said, I represent, and once I hid in a church. I went to a church and I hid in the pastor's office. I asked, I know he'll find me in the sanctuary, please put me somewhere else. And he unlocked a door and I was in the pastor's office with my kids, scared, barefoot. I just ran out the door with what I had on. And yes, he did come to the church and he did look, but he didn't find me this time. Another time, I heard of other women who hid in a church, and these were prostitutes, and they kept going into this church in Hollywood and lying down and sleeping in the back of the pews because they wanted to be left alone, you know, from their pimps. They won't come in the church, and they were right. And the pastor there finally figured out that he should do something. He got a grant for $25,000 and started the Mary Magdalene Project and rented a home and started a program. And Reverend Heyman, who just got her MDiv, was in charge. She became my mentor. No, I wasn't a woman in that church actually hiding. That was impossible. There was a point where I no longer turned to God at all for refuge. And that is also the experience of women with this sort of violence. They have gone to the church, and the church turned them out with bad advice or not the right place to hide them. I mean, it's that practical. Where can you hide? You may think, let's come up with this program. No, actually, we need to get to some bare bones here. So anyway, what I was so impressed by the questions in the survey was it asked about the history. And it was a privilege to make it this far, to do enough, pass through the victim phase to the survivor phase to an activist phase to now an academic, never ever being able to shake off, and nor should I, the past. It's my experience, it's not my identity. And now we get into the politics of identity with this. But I was really impressed with this study because it told the truth. And that's what we have. It's a foundation from where to go. The theory that I found at HDS that really struck home to me, it made sense, was Victor Turner's stages of social drama. I would highly recommend that any of you doing any work, out in the community to examine that. Victor Turner's social drama is in 4 stages. And this study actually fits squarely in one of them. The first one is shock. It's awareness, like 9/11 was shock. How could this happen? It absolutely represents the most obvious evidence of social destabilization. Things are not where they should be. Everyone knows. That happens with domestic violence. A scene can happen that's so bad, no one can deny our house no one can deny that there's disorder now. Okay, that's social drama. The second is an assessment of why, how. Let's do some fact-finding. That's what this study is. Okay? What's so fascinating about the shock and awareness phase is that an old problem is news to some. So that although this has been going on for millennium, for some, depending on how you present it, they go through shock. That's good. Now let's get to the awareness. Let's get to the particulars, and that's what the Sojourn study is. That's phase 2. From here, we can design, we can reevaluate best practices. okay? That's what my talk is, best practices. The final is initiate a new vision or mission into the life of the church. We're not there yet. That's collaborative interventions are established. We're not there yet. Maybe it's in pockets, like you said, and there's gaps. But I'm going to go just obscenely fast forward through history, scandalously so, just in 2 slides. I was asked, was one of the questions, history. Okay, I'm going to jump from history to a theory fast. Okay, here we go. All right, this is the Emperor Claudius, and he subdues Britannia, who's depicted as a woman. Okay, this is NYU's Institute of Fine Arts excavation. And so, the next slide maps theory over this. Roman patriarchal relationships with visual representation. You have Claudius to one side. A word was crossed out. It was the penetrator conqueror is right here. And then opposite, you have the penetrator defeated, and then you have the nation Britannia. And obviously, Britannia is the woman. Britannia was colonized. Women, through time, have been a colonized people. And it doesn't matter your race. You're colonized under patriarchy. That is the theory here that we're trying to upend. And this brings me to one of the suggestions that I have, and there were so many, but I thought what I could contribute to effectively was identity politics and the power of naming. We have victim, survivor, we have so many, but I felt, victim equals defeated. And I shudder sometimes. I would prefer, if I would advise people, politically correct, try to rarely use that word, because it just seems to take the steam out of somebody. It also suggests that you have, in legal terms, victims are the subjects in a court case. And there's no such thing as a good victim, rarely. A subject, if they have a troubling past, oh my God, now we have a bad subject. I hope we can get a conviction, because our subject is not a perfect victim. And yet you frame the person as a victim. It's better to look at the boundary violations versus the personality. Then we move over, basically here's one of the quotes from a professor of law, Daria, who I got to meet while I was here. And she writes in one of her journal articles, the first step in the transformative project of identity politics is a critical attention to the process by which some groups are defined as bad subjects and denied full access to the resources of self-fashioning. So what's our starting point? I am concerned about the use of victim. I think we should interrogate that more. The next is survivor. Survivor, a close cousin of victim. Unlike a defeated victim, however, survivor contributes the notion of resiliency to an identity. At the same time, a survivor has a time stamp. It is a word that shouts, it happened then, this is now, move on. Consider a survivor of Katrina. But sexual and gender violence is man-made, not a force of nature like a hurricane. And it was part of a systemic ordering. It was not a passing storm. And if the violence was part of socialization, then the effects are being experienced today, not back then. Could it be that the term survivor also unintentionally subverts reintegration within the community due to our culture's preference and attention span for current events? Survivors can be left behind like old news, very much like they want to focus on trafficking now. Bored with the survivors. What's new? What's next? Trafficking is going to move on. I'm sorry, I've been around this most of my life. I prefer veteran now. I'm thinking we need to search for solidarity with a class that is roundly respected for surviving battlefields and war. Veteran. And I know it's military, and we have the process of recruitment, enlistment, and further training and compliance and service, and it is systemic. But it can be argued that the marriage family is also, there's kind of like an enlistment, there's a whole socialization behind the institution of marriage as well, what you will do, how you will be. And then it was, of course, the veteran is also someone who's discharged or released, therefore, under conditions other than dishonorable. And you go, oh, wait, do we lose the right to use the term veteran of domestic violence if a marriage ended in a divorce? After all, it's a dishonorable ending to a marriage. And I thought about it. I thought, no, there seems to be a correlation to dishonorable discharge there, but wait. But there's a deeper correlation, and it's justice. Not neatly matching semantic categories. For in the spirit of justice and harmony, a marriage can end with honor through divorce because it was a greater dishonor that the family falsely represented itself as a safe haven, which is a core stabilizer in society. Win or lose, regardless of sides or status, all are veterans of a struggle, and what is most encouraging about veteran is that this status brings both compassion and honor, not ignorance and shame. Veterans have a narrative of resilience, PTSD, and reintegration issues. Despite struggles, veterans can hold their heads up high and are sought after for transferable skill sets of tenacity under fire. And who introduced the whole idea of the military concepts into the domestic environment was Judith Herman. And we adopted it. We brought in PTSD to the masses, not just Army veterans. And it made me think, why aren't we appropriating these others as well? And just picking out when we should use these terms, but not being trapped in any one of them. And so with that, I'll end my talk. And I think I'm done, right? Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just add one or two details to Ahmed's description of what it is that we do. We have a prayer service in Porter Square at 9 in the morning. I'm assuming that all of you are intimately familiar with Cambridge. We have another prayer service at 1 o'clock on the Cambridge Common. After that, we take a lot of sandwiches, a lot of juice, a lot of socks, a lot of toiletries, and in the winter, hats and gloves and scarves around Harvard Square and then around Central Square. Some volunteers do exactly the same thing, but without the ministers, on Saturday afternoon. So we are putting a meal out there, simple as it is, on Saturdays and Sundays, which is a time when it's awfully hard to find something to eat in Cambridge. On Tuesdays, we do the same route, but without food, so we have a chance to talk to people about themselves and not about whether they want tuna salad or egg salad. On Thursdays, I'm over at the wet shelter at 240 Albany Street, on the MIT campus where we have a service of Compline. And the rest of the time, when I'm a minister, I am in prisons, in hospitals, in locked wards, any place where our people are likely to be. And our people are likely to be in those places because there is something like a conveyor belt which operates between the street and prisons and locked wards and mental institutions and hospitals. We are out there to minister to people who are chronically homeless. That means to us people who are either in a shelter or on the street. The likelihood that they will ever get off the street is very, very low. What we do is like hospice care. Just as hospice kicks in when medicine no longer has anything to offer, the well-being of a patient, we appear, as it were, when social services are no longer effective. And because almost all of our people are mentally unstable or abusing some substance, and invariably both, most likely both, they are largely incapable of managing large array of social services. Cambridge is an excellent place, has the greatest range and most carefully and widely developed set of social services, probably of any city of its size in the country. That does not avail our people. They are simply incapable of making any sense of them. So we are out there. I think we've missed 2 Sundays in 11 years. We are a ministry of presence and not of metrics. We do not expect our people to get better in any conventional sense. We do expect them to be welcomed into the church, which we have brought out for them, as Ahmed has said, because they are unable or unwilling to go inside. The environment, the world in which our people live is fraught with violence, some of it personal, some of it systemic. The kinds of people we minister to are, by their very character, extremely violent. Harvard Square, Central Square, Porter Square, and 240 Albany Street are 4 of the 5 largest crime centers in Cambridge. They really generate, among them, 80 to 90% of all crime calls. Part of it is interpersonal. Part of it has to do with drugs. Part of it has to do with mental illness. And part of it has to do with systemic problems. There is not surprisingly, a strong police presence wherever our people are. And so our people are constantly at the mercy of a kind of a low-level enforcement, which in the hands of some policemen is very gently and capably handled, in the hands of others not so capably and gently handled. So we spend a lot of time in court with our people, character references, providing pro bono counsel, but in fact it makes little difference because they will simply return to the street either after the hearing or after spending some time in jail, equally unprepared to live a non-criminal life, and they will be back in court or back in prison very soon. The larger systemic problem is that it is impossible to be homeless without being a criminal. It is impossible to find a place to urinate without being, if you are found by a policeman, arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior. It is impossible to find a place to sleep without trespassing if you're so scared of a shelter that you refuse to go into one. So that the things that we take for granted, there's those sort of basic things that you learn in Biology 101 about what it means to be alive and not be a rock, it turns out to be very, very hard to do that if you're not in a place that provides those services for you. So, not surprisingly, our people are constantly in and out of institutions, always unprepared, either to return to the street or, for that matter, to return to the institution. And so, nothing ever changes in our people's lives. Having said that, there are sets of people out there for whom the violence is especially dangerous and pronounced. They are women and young adults. Women are forced to do things on the street that men, by and large, are not. They either are forced to engage in prostitution to find money on which to survive, or they are forced to sell their bodies for protection from one guy as against random encounters with other guys during the night. They are far more likely to be physically abused. They are far more likely to have no place to go once they have been, so that the level of violence ratchets up significantly for women on the street. If it can be said to be worse, it probably is for young adults. They tend to arrive in Cambridge in early summer, where they blend well with summer school students and people who want to look like summer school students. And when they arrive here, it is said that within 48 hours, most young men and women will be touched in some way by prostitution. Most also will find themselves drinking and either dealing in drugs or using them. They have come here to escape an abusive home, an abusive school, and in the case of gay and lesbian kids, abuse everywhere. Some 25 to 40% of all young adults on the street are probably gay and lesbian, and they are probably out there because no matter how abusive the street is, it's a better choice than what they were running away from. Comes the fall, nights get cold, some kids will go home, others will not. They will stay out there. And because they are so suspicious of adult institutions, shelters, meals programs, federal programs like Social Security, they tend to be outdoors far more than any other group of people, and as such are exposed to more and a different quality of violence than almost anybody else. Having said that, I despair at identifying, much less seeing put in place, some kind of change which will address the kind of cultural preconceptions about homeless people, about gay people, about women, that is likely to make a difference, certainly in my lifetime. One of my hopes here is to get some idea as to where to look for solutions like that. I'm not sure that as a church of presence that we would be in a position to put it in place, and yet it would be well to have hope and to be able to offer hope to the people to whom we minister, if we do nothing else. But it is, there are some 150 chronically homeless people in Cambridge. We probably see most of them in the course of a week or a month. We have nothing to offer them except our presence. And while I think that that is important, otherwise it wouldn't be there, we are ever mindful of the lives that they lead, hidden but out in the open, and seemingly beyond the help of even the people who most care about them. So I am eager to hear more from you, the rest of the panel, about where we are to look for what to do with our congregants. Thank you.
Good evening. We have been bombarded with news stories about sexual and gender-based violence that shakes our landscape, creates tremors of outrage, and continues to break the silence about the tragic prevalence of this problem. According to the United Nations, sexual and gender-based violence refers to violations of fundamental human rights that perpetuate sex stereotype roles that deny human dignity and the self-determination of the individual and hamper human development. They refer to physical, sexual, psychological, and emotional harm that reinforces female subordination and perpetuates male power and control. While gender-based violence has a devastating impact on the lives of women and girls who are the majority of victims and survivors, it also renders the healthy development of men and boys. Sexual and gender-based violence is largely rooted in unequal power relations that perpetuate and condone violence within the family, the community, and the state. Most victims of sexual and gender-based violence are stigmatized and blamed for the violence they experience. Because of the secrecy surrounding the problem, the number of people living in or within violent relationships is underestimated. This means that as bad as we know the problem to be, it may be even worse because of underreporting. We have become so accustomed to acts of violence in our daily experience that we have learned to accept it as an ordinary part of life. And if that in itself is not shocking, it most certainly should be. Although the presence of sexual and gender-based violence is extensively researched and documented, Rising violence against women points to some disturbing facts. Not enough is being done to stem the tide, when 1 in 4 women will experience some form of physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime. When 1 in 7 women will experience stalking victimization during their lifetime, in which they have felt very fearful or believe that they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. When every year, more than 3 million children witness domestic violence in their homes. And when 30 to 60% of the children who live in those homes where domestic violence takes place also suffer abuse and neglect. For the fortunate among us who have not been directly touched by sexual or gender violence, we feel removed from it, not giving it a second thought. Often, the closest we come is a public exposure of someone else's misfortune. We see or hear about some violent event in the news. It may feel surreal to us, but it still triggers fear and anger and perhaps a sense of helplessness. Here's an example of an unfortunate situation, one that underlines or underscores the stereotype of black men as dangerous. If you're not a football fan, many of you may have not heard of Ray Rice or the Baltimore Ravens. Not until the viral running of a certain videotape did we know who he was. Last February, a security tape in an elevator caught Rice punching his fiancée, Janae Palmer, in the face, knocking her unconscious, and then dragging her out of the elevator like an old rag doll. Rice was arrested and indicted on third-degree aggravated assault charges. His fiancée later dropped the charges, and the video remained out of public eye until it was disclosed by DMZ, a celebrity news website, in early September. So one question is, where was the video all this time? NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell responded quickly and defensively, reporting that he had no knowledge of the video and that he would implement tougher policy changes regarding how the NFL handles domestic violence cases. Rice's contract was terminated on September 8th, and he was suspended from the National Football League indefinitely. And the most shocking part, Janae Palmer and Ray Rice were married, and probably the second thing is there's talk that Ray Rice will be reinstated by another team. On another score, college administrators now have a term for the period between Labor Day and Thanksgiving. It's called the red zone. Entering students are transitioning from living at home with family to moving away and becoming independent. For most college students, this is a period of vulnerability and heightened anxiety. The demand for changes are many and come all at once, making new friends, negotiating unfamiliar living conditions and personal space, and adjusting to the demands of college, all without their familiar support system. According to the Boston Globe, college students are considered to be most at risk of sexual assault, accidental injury, and alcohol poisoning during this period. In fact, 4 college students were suspended from Framingham State College yesterday for 2 sexual assaults over the weekend. And a student at Stonehill College reported being sexually assaulted early Sunday morning while walking on campus. This follows a year of sexual assaults on college campuses across the country. Has the number of sexual assaults increased, or are we doing a better job of reporting incidents? I suspect both. Many colleges have heightened Title IX compliance of gender equity by putting clear sexual assault policies in place. Some, like Harvard, have begun training administrators and support staff on what to look for and how to handle sexual assault cases. But are we only skimming the surface of sexual and gender-based violence? What else must we be doing to take action and to work toward gender equity and shared power? What is the role of clergy on campuses, at home, and in society? When religious leaders create a safe space for victims, supporting them with competent pastoral care and counseling, they play a significant role in restoring their dignity. On home ground, these leaders can offer acceptance, support, advice, and sometimes intervention. When students are away from home, at college, for instance, religious leaders and chaplains can offer these same supports, as well as a substitute for the lost safety of the familiar surroundings of home, family, and friends. and they can help provide the encouragement to victims to encourage that this is not a time to be independent and to encourage them to contact their families. Victims of violence often have deep questions about their religious belief. Clergy can learn how to best address these questions by participating in ongoing education and training in sexual and gender-based violence, connecting with advocacy groups in their area, and providing a strong link to safety net programs and counseling. Continuing education courses and learning how to be effective in dealing with people at risk should be required for all clergy. This includes learning how to counsel perpetrators, helping victims and their families deal with trauma, and understanding what it means to be a compassionate presence. Victims of violence should not have to choose between their safety and their church. When clergy are competent in attending to crises, members of the congregation feel supported and encouraged to seek treatment without compromising their beliefs. The collaboration between IMA World Health and Sojourners that commissioned the survey of Protestant ministers' view on sexual and gender-based violence is a hopeful sign that ministers are ready to take the next step in developing competency skills to serve victims of violence and people at risk. Thank you.
Many thanks to all our panelists. We would like this to be more of a conversation that we discuss these particular issues. And before opening the floor to questions, I would like to ask our panelists for their reflections on the environment as a whole. So we talked a lot about the roles that particular people or leaders or people in leadership can do. What about an overall environment? What do we need in an environment that would enable these people to perform their roles, but also provide more support to the victims and survivors? Yeah.
My first thought was, I'm always going to speak from the place of representation. But what helped me to feel safe in coming forward was seeing that there were people that could be approached that would just really talk to you. And maybe I wasn't ready to share my business yet, but here was someone who could relax and just give you a little bit of time. It was that simple. And what I will say about this is that there was an expectation in the report that the top dog, so to speak, should know the full-on Monty about domestic violence and sexual violence. And I found in all my time in the church, they didn't know nearly as much as the boots on the ground. They did not know as much as the associate pastors. Part of my talk was about that, got switched around by me, by something else. That associates get the dirty work, and that you have to love the dirty work. And that's what I looked for. I looked for people that just that weren't afraid of the unloved. I felt unloved. I looked well on the outside, but how I felt on the inside, two different worlds. And then when it got really bad, I felt this one person, I had their phone number, I could call them and just be quiet. And she goes, "There's something really wrong." I go, "There is." And then we met, and I was able to tell her some of my story. But I want to tell you, it's that simple as these pockets of people that are available. I can tell you that head pastor, he's not, or she is not available. Sorry. They'd like to be. Maybe they started out that way. But in practical terms, the ones that really get the work done are some of the few anointed in the pews that think, "Oh, I can't be that guy, so don't even put me on that track. I just want to minister to my brothers and sisters, or some of the low-level people. I'm sorry to put them on a hierarchy, but I can assure you those are the ones, like Reverend Jeddediah, I'm telling you, there were a few people like you in California that I could go to and not be ashamed of my business. And I can put that on one hand when it was at the worst. And Reverend Heyman was one. And if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be here. So the environment is just a few people, they don't even know they're doing it, but you witness them. You witness someone ministering to someone who's just doesn't fit in well, or they're distressed, and you watch how they minister to them, and you're going, oh God, I could talk to that person. And it may take you another 2 weeks, but you might just have a chance running and you go, hi, you know? I'm telling you, you have no idea. That's been my experience with Serenity Sisters. One woman who came to our meeting didn't open up for like 2 months. And when she did, it was with me. I couldn't believe her story. There wasn't enough I could do. She hung herself. When I came to HDS, in 6 months she was gone. There weren't enough of us around her. But I'm telling you that it is a battle. There you go.
So one thing that comes to mind is, as I think about this, is really none of us want to do this work, right? Let's be honest. I mean, and in order to do this work, we need competency training. We need to learn how to develop relationships with people, relationships of trust. People that have been alienated aren't going to be quickly move. Most of us don't move quickly into relationships, period. And so the thing that strikes me is that that we need to let people express their fear. But this is going to be a big project in the sense of moving at, in incremental stages. And as I was thinking about this in preparation for the panel tonight, a couple things came to mind. We need to continue doing the research, and I think this research is just powerful in the ways that other people have talked about it. We have to do education and training. I don't know if there's continuing education credit for ministers. As a licensed psychologist, I have to do, and as a doctor, you have to do a certain number of CEUs every couple of years. That should be instituted, I thought, long ago for ministers, so that if you've been out for a couple of years, you go back and do pastoral counseling, you go back and look at theology and all those different things. It has to be education and training. The way we talk about people or think about things, I use victims and survivors in my language because in the research they use them, and I think of victims as someone who's just at the beginning stages and a survivor. But you're right, the language is clumsy and it really is kind of depersonalizes or dehumanizes in a way. But I didn't have better language. But we need to have clergy continuing to train to understand things as they move and change. So research, education, training. Advocacy, learning how to be an advocate, going down to City Hall to help people for all sorts of reasons to be an advocate, advocating for their own community, the space to be swept, kept clean, and probably the fourth area is service, places of service, so that the church itself or someplace near it can be a safety net, and that the minister can have some involvement in this. I see clergy as a sort of bridge to help people who have been victimized, traumatized in that process. But it may not be the senior minister. It doesn't have to be. It could be the associate minister. It might be a pastoral care team in a particular church setting. So we have to find out what works and not think of it as a one-size-fits-all way of dealing with it. But even as a psychologist, when I worked at Boston Medical Center, and I worked largely with kids and adolescents, and they would come in and the families, the mother had been abused or whatever, you look at it and you think, I don't want to do this. You hear something in your head say, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And I don't want to do this was the part of me that was really scared shitless, about what am I going to say to these people that's going to make a difference? You know what? Nothing. You bring your compassionate presence and you learn to listen. And you recycle that fear into learning about what it means to really be compassionate. And imagine yourself sitting in that same spot, and what would you want? You would want somebody that really didn't see color, didn't see size, didn't see income, but just saw your human heart and wanting to embrace you. So a lot needs to be done, and I think some ministers, pastors will be able to do this. I have a hard time with the word pastor. That to me it sounds so patriarchal, so I try not to use it. Minister is the word that works for me. So, you know, and work with the people that you can work with, and the people that you can't work with, perhaps they can appoint somebody else within their institutions, because I don't think everybody's going to be ready to do this work. So.
I respond well to "Hey you" as well as pastor or minister or reverend. I'll build on what Cheryl just said. The environment that I would seek to change, being one of those few that I actually have any connection with, is that one in which ministers are educated and trained. The reason I'm here is because of my experience on the street. It's unique, it's, as Mary says, boots on the ground. It's not an experience that many other people have, and so I speak with such authority as I have about what homeless people endure in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That would be true if I were just a lawyer or just a social worker or indeed just a citizen who had set out to do exactly this but didn't call it a church. So I think what has happened now is that we now look to, rather than ministers speaking with any authority by virtue of their being ministers, they speak with the authority of their experience. And Lord knows that's crucial because nobody else has the experience. But I would like to see a re-examining of the reviving of the question of what it is that makes ministers different, if they are, than anybody else out there. What it is that we uniquely bring to the questions that the panel has considered and talked about. Is it just that we're good people or we care, or is it that by virtue of being ministers that we approach this stuff with a very different way? And I'd suggest that the place that we start is with ourselves, that we take ourselves more seriously as ministers, and expect and hope that other people will take us more seriously as ministers. It actually means something. So I'd be hard-pressed to name a famous theologian who has been active in, I'm going to say, the last 60 years. It was a commonplace up through the 60s, but it's not anymore. So, like college presidents, who of them speak with authority now about education? I'd like to see at least a re-examining of that and asking of what is the difference between being a person of faith and just being a good and caring person.
I think this discussion, particularly about having other important actors on the ground other than what we perceive to be in the top positions, is something that we were thinking about a lot in working on this research, and that one of the first things that we intend to do in this research program is basically to identify these actors and to see who are in the right position or who actually, for one reason or another, become these significant actors within the environment, and try to provide tools and support for these people, because again, it is not necessarily the person who is officially at the top, but rather there are so many other actors. Many of them are just take this initiative on their own and try to help to the best of their abilities. So I would like to open for questions and comments.
Actually, this is a follow-on on what you said about...
Can you wait for a second for the mic?
Oh, maybe I'll reconsider. I just want to follow up on your mention of other actors, because I've been sitting here really appreciating the fact of this event and appreciating the diversity of experiences here, and also realizing that there, from my point of view, is at least one actor or one voice experience that's not here. And those are the women, I'm going to say overwhelmingly the women who for 40 years now have been providing services to the survivors, veterans, and victims of intimate violence and sexual assault. And I say that because I've been the director of 2 domestic violence agencies, one here in Massachusetts and the other in Oakland, California. And we had very highly developed education and training programs, so, my cultural competence, empathy building, and awareness building. And our leading target for this education work were indeed actually churches, both in California and in Massachusetts, especially in Massachusetts. So one thing I'm wondering about sitting here is, and I kind of have a macro question for you, Rick, as you distribute the results of this survey, and that survey could have been done 10 years ago, 20, 30, and we've been seeing this same data for a long time now. As you distribute the 2014 version, are you also going to be distributing the wealth of information about the training that's out there from individual shelters and agencies, from the state groups, from the national groups? And then, and I assume you are, I just wanted to hear more about that. And then, for instance, Reverend Mannis, I thought for you, here you are in Cambridge. Cambridge has one of the very oldest domestic violence agencies in the country. It's one of the few that provides services not only to women who've suffered, cis women, born female women, who suffer violence at the hands of men, but also to gay men who've experienced it from another man, woman-woman violence, and also transgender violence, which is, you mentioned the disproportionate violence against gay and lesbian youth, far, far higher, of course, for transgender youth and people. So they have a wonderful training program, and I'm wondering, what could they do to make themselves known to you and people in your position who want the training, who want the support, but just may not know actually the wealth of resources that are out there, certainly in a state like Massachusetts.
Yeah, so I'll just respond. I think, as I said earlier, I think the idea of what we were trying to do with We Will Speak Out is to really create a platform for different organizations to join and share experiences. And so for example, we're doing little microcosms. So in Carroll County, Maryland, where IMA has a second office, we've been connecting to the Domestic Violence Center there with local pastors. We're doing training. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's vital. And I think in Oregon, where we're also, we have a kind of interesting places where we have linkages, but a lot of it was based on relationships. And the whole idea is that the clergy, for the most part, aren't trained, and that they need to find these local resources. And we're not trying to reinvent the local resources. We know they're out there. So I think that's a critical piece actually, as the research goes forward, how churches are linking to those local resources, I think will be a really interesting question to drill down on. The other thing I was going to say is there's a lot of as you said, there's a lot of interesting groups doing a lot of work. I mentioned safe havens, and one of the things we're trying to do with the coalition, the We Will Speak Out coalition, is to try to bring groups like that together with other groups. There's Man Up. There's I think that actually something that hasn't been talked about on the panel is involving men more in this conversation, and how do they get, what are some positive forms of masculinity that need to be modeled and shown. So I think there's just so much more that needs to be done, and there's a lot of groups doing that as well. And how do you create those linkages between them?
We serve as an intermediary between the many social service groups you're describing and people we see on the street. We are chock-a-block with phone numbers, with every piece of information a person might want about reaching a shelter for battered women, a housing agency. And indeed, there is this wonderful 20-page document online, which I think lists every social service available for homeless people in Cambridge and Somerville. Our issue is, with that as with so much, getting people to use those phone numbers. We will, if we see somebody who looks like they've been torn to pieces, if they will agree to do it, we will pop them in a cab, take them over to a hospital, take them to, anything we can do. The problem we confront most often is that we can't get a person to accept the social service. I mean, and I appreciate that's not true for most homeless people, true for our guys. What has worked better, in the sense in which you're asking, a lot of the churches that support us also come out with us on the odd Sunday. Groups of children, young adults, their parents, and they see for the first time what it looks like to be homeless or to be mentally unstable or to be drinking or drugging or all of them together. It's a shock, and people go back to their churches and take with them, I think, an experience and understanding that they never had before, and which we probably couldn't describe to them if we, even if we wanted to. Our experience in general is that if we can invite people, pastors, students, interns, and children, out with us to see what we see, then that will be the most effective change agent that we can possibly generate. But I have to tell you that not very many ministers come around with us. It's a hard sell.
Other questions or comments?
Thank you for being here tonight and for this seminar. It's really educational. I just want to say my name is Cynthia, by the way, and I just came back from a domestic violence counseling center in Brockton. And the woman, she was a mature, beautiful woman. We sat down. We started out by saying a prayer. And we listened to a couple of inspiring gospel music. And, we just went back and forth. She had the education around domestic violence. She understood my issue as a mother. And she had teenagers, so she shared some anecdotal information. And it was largely a spiritual, compassionate experience. I just got over, I'm still dealing as a veteran, I like that wording, of a 10-year marriage that wasn't like he beat me up, leaving all these ugly bruises and you can go to court with it, but more of emotional abuse to the point of madness. Mm-hmm. And I got married kind of late in life. And, it was always fine. I'm college educated. I have an MSW from Boston College. I worked in the mental health industry and managed care, so on and so forth. Not so much with domestic violence, but with mental health issues. And we get married, have a child, and things got just really crazy along the way. It was hard for me to put a label on what it was. It was just craziness. I would talk to my family members, but not too many people. After all, we lived in the suburbs, and we're all trying to, keep up with the Joneses and things like that. But there was episodic problems, and it just escalated. At one point, I just needed to get out of the house. I don't care where I ended up at. I ended up in a hospital. And out of that, I ended up with some kind of diagnosis. I'm trying to tell them that he's the problem. And they said, well, you are the patient. So I get diagnosed and medication, that whole thing. I went through that journey. I had a psychiatrist, a therapist. I've had all these teams of people, all these supports, and not one person identify what my real problem was. I even had a therapist, and in my field it was okay to see a therapist and things like that for actualization purposes. But, one time I went in there frantic and said that he threatened to kill me. And that just somehow went over, To make a long story short, we ended up, actually he initiated a court custody battle because we pretty much was at the end of our marriage, and he had a lot of circumstantial problems. by the way, he is not an American, and that was another barrier because the ways the laws were generated, we all feared he would get deported, you know, if I reported him. So there was all these different barriers, socioeconomic, social pressures. But one day, somehow, long story, I ended up getting a phone number, and I called a domestic violence agency, and my whole world opened up. They told me what it was I was dealing with, and from that point, I started educating myself and reading a lot of literature and understanding the different ways power and control can be abusive emotionally. We ended up in court. He went there first. He got custody of my son. And so I ended up getting involved with protective mothers issues because I'm finding courts, some courts are better than others, but in general, courts are geared to create division, okay? So that, you know, you can get lawyers and pay all this money and so on and so forth. And because I lost custody under false allegations, I ended up getting all these attorneys. I went into foreclosure trying to get my son back because that was another layer of violence, victimization that I was dealing with. And now I'm worried about my son and what he's going through. So that went on for years and years. And quite frankly, I had to find God again in this because there's nothing else that can help you. I didn't find, now I'm not gonna just totally write off the mental health industry, but today, sadly, if you're using your insurance, it's really largely based on medication and you know, just really quick therapy. There's not a lot of room to, unless you're well-trained in this area. The particular court I was entrapped in, actually, really didn't have trained domestic violence advocates. And so that complicated matters. In fact, when I mentioned it to the judge, you know, there's this whole group now here in this country of protective mothers losing custody of their children because abusive men are running into court to retaliate and use the child as a wedge. Now, I don't want to get into the whole mother's battle, father's battle, because there's some issues, legitimate issues that fathers have. But what's happening now is out of Washington, there's these fathers' rights grants, and even churches are getting these grants through HHS. And so the whole pendulum is shifting for fathers to get custody, you know, under these grants. And mothers are unfairly losing out because the bottom line is, through my experience and through many other parents involved or entrapped in family court, is that they're not really finding real justice, and courts are becoming more of another area to display power, control, and violence. Now, with respect to the churches, I am a Christian. I study the Bible. I love Jesus. And I find all the answers are in the Bible for families, for fathers, for mothers, for children. And I have been running around to different churches during my ordeals trying to get help, okay? And there is an utter lack of understanding. In fact, it's kind of like a problem, you know, for a lot of people, other families, your friends. It's a problem. It's really hard. You know, I think about the story of Adam and Eve. You know, it's somebody tore off somebody's leaf, and, you know, there's shame. There's a lot of shame associated around people losing control of themselves and, you know, hitting and all of that. You know, we have veterans coming back from war. They have a lot of trauma issues. And it's getting, through displacement, you know, they're taking it out on their wives or, you know, vice versa, or in their children. This is, I feel, a public health emergency that we all need to embrace and not to condemn, you know, and I'm not condemning Father. He has issues, you know. My son, you know, really wants his parents to get along, you know, and I think he deserves that. I can't stress enough the critical role, I think, today of churches, because it's really, it's a learned behavior, yes, but it's really a soul issue. You know, I reflect back in all of the issues that we went through. It's actually spiritual warfare,
Yeah.
you know, and a lot of our policies are geared, sadly, to promote division. You know, I can understand some of those kids out there who don't want to go into the system because they were probably abused in foster care. I'm not saying that every foster care is bad, but there's some reason these kids are running around refusing to go into the system. The system needs compassion, which a church can truly provide. And I just want to say one more thing about a church.
Cynthia?
Yes.
You know,
I'm going
you
on and on.
represent, you absolutely represent, and I hear in you a wounded healer who's just getting started
Yes.
and will absolutely have a phenomenal impact.
I pray so.
Absolutely. No,
Pray so.
it's
We need you all.
Just claim it and
Yes.
know that you are saying enough's enough. And there's a time to do that. You're in a great place to build from here.
That's great.
I
need
want to
churches.
just add just one little caveat to what you were saying. You mentioned the churches really quickly. I'm a Roman Catholic, and I went into the rites of reconciliation, and this is in between, in the summer break here. And the Monsignor, this is in California, and the Monsignor, I get in there, and at the time I had quite a bit of a grassroots helping women in crisis. I was known for it. I get into the confessional, and the Monsignor says, "Mary, I'm glad to see you." I'm like, "Oh no, I'm like, what is this?" And he doesn't even wait to hear what is troubling me as a spiritual director might want to hear. Instead, in the enclosure, he goes, "There's a woman that needs help." And in all this time, even someone is knocking on the door of the confessional because it took so long and I never got a word out about a woman who was in great distress in all of her issues. And it was in the confessional, so just like his, my lips were sealed and he was divulging. And this is a Monsignor who said that he was allowing this woman to sleep in the church up on the balcony, and he knew that the council would just throw a fit if they knew he wasn't overruling the deacon on this, you know? So he was trying to do something, knew he would just get shouted out. "You've got your pen." I didn't even say a word. He goes, "Your penance is to help this woman." And then he did the absolution, and I was out the door. So I'm just as a real concrete example of a wounded healer. They couldn't have enlisted anyone else who could just immediately plug into this woman. And yes, I did help her, but just letting you know the connection of the top to the bottom, the wounded healer is often seen there. No, our acts aren't perfectly together. I don't think they ever will be, but that's part of our beauty, I think. And so there you have it. It's going to be a mixed story, complex. It's always complex.
We'll take
So
one
sorry.
more question, and then we can move the discussion to the reception. Please go ahead.
I don't know if this is a question or just a comment. I came here to support my partner, Cheryl, and I've been sitting here for the last hour and a half with my heart beating a mile a minute because this is a subject that is so near and dear to my heart. from actually two perspectives. I am a veteran from many, many years ago, but not so long ago that I'll ever forget it. And I also have spent 20 years working with homeless populations. I've run men's programs, I've run women's homeless programs, and I've also spent many, many years as a volunteer. And one thing that I do want to say is that, Reverend, I was so glad to hear you say that the ministers are not coming out as volunteers. So many programs that I have been involved with that were feeding programs, we had the most wonderful church groups come in week after week, and they were just the most wonderful, lovely, non-judgmental people, and they worked their butts off to create a wonderful meal. I never ever once, in all my experience of doing that, and there were hundreds and hundreds of nights that I was in, you know, a meal service, never once saw a church leader or a synagogue leader. So thank you for tacking that on. And I think maybe that's part of the problem. The other thing that I want to say is that as a former veteran, I love that term, Mary, thank you. You know, one of the things that happens with women who are living in domestic violence situations, or, you know, who find themselves in a situation of date rape or other kinds of violence, is that often, of course not always, but often the reason that it happens is because of a total lack of self-esteem. And what feeds that self-esteem internally, you know, within a relationship, is that the perpetrator will often, you know, will remind the woman over and over again that she just isn't worth it, that everything that's going on is her fault. From an outward perspective, in our society, we're still, as women, colonized. We, you know, in every area, from showing anorexic models and objectifying women to not having equal pay scales. I mean, these are all ways of telling women that they're not worth it. And so when you take someone who has such a poor sense of self-esteem and you are looking at a religious leader to find a way to find common ground and meet with them, I think it's important to look at the fact that, you know, we lay people often look at our religious leaders as people who are elevated, people who tell us that we are, you know, God's children, that we have value, that we're all part of the congregation, that we're all a part of this, that we're all important. And inside, what so many of these women are saying, and I speak from not just personal experience, but from experience of the people that I've worked with, we're saying, that doesn't include me. And I think that it's so important in this amazing work that you're talking about, that clergy leaders be taught that they are not just meeting with someone and trying to find ways to be culturally competent, but to realize that they're dealing with someone who probably inside is not believing a word that they're saying, that they're worth the help. And, you know, you guys have the answers. I don't know how to, you know, how you would train somebody to do that, but I just want to say that I think it should be a really important part of your work, is to, you know, recognize and try to pull out some self-esteem in victims or veterans. Thank you.
Any final comments from you? So we will move now the rest of our conversation to the reception in the Brown Room. Thank you all, and many thanks to our panel for such very thoughtful conversation. Thank you.